When I was a boy, I read a good deal about it. There were still a lot of studies. Bruce Catton had written his series. I was around, I was a young adolescent during the first centennial, which was kind of romanticizing the war. And there were still a lot of reminders of the war between the states at home. There were people whose ancestors had died in the early 1900s who were still veterans, both sides. There were still lots of stories and fables. There was great interest. Sectionally, the Eastern Shore was an interesting kind of mix. If you really study Maryland history, Maryland stayed in the Union, but there was a sizable secessionist element in Maryland. The Eastern Shore, by most of the good histories I've read, was about evenly divided. You can kind of see that through the newspapers. Centerville had a Unionist newspaper and a secessionist newspaper. Cambridge, Salisbury had a secessionist newspaper called the Sentinel, and the paper burned in the fire of 1860, burned down the downtown area in Salisbury. The editor went south in '61 and joined the Confederate Army. Worcester County had a paper that was at first pro-Union, but then pro-Southern. Somerset had the Somerset Union, which was pro-Southern, pro-secessionist, but it also had a Unionist newspaper. So there was a lot of division. And the newspapers on the Eastern Shore, even the ones that were pro-Union, made allowance for the institution of slavery. It was an economic system that if they felt that if it folded, it would bring ruin. It ultimately didn't. The Maryland Constitution in 1864 ended it. But there was so much political wrangling and so much fighting politically about the question that even though the Eastern Shore was pacified militarily, there were still pretty deep arguments about it. The newspaper publishers essentially used their opinions as news, and everything was cast, Yankee hordes, secessionist traitors, it was, and all of the editors of all of the pro-Southern newspapers were eventually either banished from the Eastern Shore, arrested, sent to Fort McHenry. There was a steamship called the Balloon. They would send it down from Baltimore with the provost marshals, and they would, I think the Balloon took away Mr. Thomas Robson, the editor of the Eastern Star. He went to Fort McHenry for a while, and then the Shenandoah Valley. He was banished. It also took away the editor in, I think, Centerville. So when you saw the Balloon making its way up your rivers, you were in trouble. Along with the slaveholding states, there was less industry. There was an economic, they were agrarian. The Eastern Shore had some light industry and railroads that went to Salisbury. Southern Maryland had none of that. So the Eastern Shore was more evenly divided. The odd dichotomy is that there were lots of Whigs, old-time Whigs, who were slaveholders and large slaveholders. The largest one in Somerset County was a Union officer. My distant ancestor in Pickett's charge, Thomas Jefferson Dashiell, with the 9th Virginia, who survived Pickett's charge, owned no slaves. I think that many people who were embarrassed by slavery fought for the South nonetheless because you fought for your community. And that was another thing that James McPherson said, that you essentially, when your state was attacked, when your community was attacked, whether you had an economic stake in it or there was that issue wasn't as important as it was them against us. Maryland was one of those states that if you were in Vermont, you had no choice. You would fight for the Union. If you were in South Carolina, you would fight for your state. If you were in Maryland, you had to make a decision. Your ancestors were from Virginia, or they lived in, you had family in Virginia, you had friends there, there was a lot of commerce. You would fight for the South. There were two federal regiments raised, they say, from the Eastern Shore called the First and Second Eastern Shore Volunteer Regiments. But each of them had companies from the Baltimore area, like a third. Somerset County, which is in the lower shore, had Company K. They were all to be Home Guard soldiers. They were not to leave the Eastern Shore, leave the state of Maryland. When Lee invaded Pennsylvania, they were called up with Lockwood's brigade and sent to Culp's Hill. When they got off the ferries in Baltimore, all the fellows from Somerset County who were very conservative, pro-Southern, refused to fight. So they were discharged dishonorably. This company from Talbot County H, many of them were raised in the trap area. They went to Culp's Hill. It's said that the Eastern Shore Regiment faced the 2nd Maryland, or the 1st Maryland Battalion, which is what it was called, which were the Confederate Marylanders at Culp's Hill. They did not face each other. They were sort of up the line. I'm sure there was some firing back and forth, but the 1st Maryland Battalion charged into Ohio and Pennsylvania troops, and they were butchered. It was very sad, but they say that, legend has it, that a number of the fellows from Trapp who were in the Union Regiment helped bury some of the Confederate Marylanders, and knew some of them. So that was the sadness of that war, and it's quite a lesson to be learned. But it's also our history, and we really need to study it, learn about it. Some people never reconciled. Some people never were friendly or associated with each other. Some families were divided. Franklin Buchanan, who was the commander of the Virginia, what people called the Merrimack, at the Battle of Hampton Roads, sank 2 ships, the Congress and the Cumberland, 2 Union wooden ships, and his brother was the purser on one of them. His brother later died in the war. Buchanan survived. He survived Mobile Bay, and he's buried here in Talbot County. Ridgeway was the second in command of the Hunley, the submarine in Charleston Harbor that sank the Housatonic, I think was the name of the blockading ship. It made naval history. He lived in Easton. He was a very brave man, very brave man. There were Dashiells who also were Unionists, but they were guarding the B&O Railroad. That was kind of like slack duty, I mean, really. Secession was not treason because you owed your allegiance to your state. After that war, we were the United States of America. We were no longer a union of states. We were a union of people. And the states were merely political subdivisions of it. And then if you carry it forward, you see that the less involved, or the more power now resides in the federal government than the states themselves, which are sort of political subdivisions, really, when you get right down to it. Sure. Remember when you were a kid and you looked into a kaleidoscope and you saw those images and they were sharp and then they would blur, and there were lots of reasons why people fought. So it's many reasons. It's a quilt of reasons. And that's why I'm not ashamed of my Confederate ancestors. I'm proud that they stood up even though for what they believed was right. And slavery, probably being a portion of it, was an abomination, we found and we know. But they didn't know any better. They were, most of them were born in the 1840s. That was a system. They didn't know any better. And and it was legal in the Union. President Obama even said that he understood that people in the South recognized the valor of their family members who fought in that war. And that's the way I feel about it. As far as taking down monuments, you can't erase or purge history. When you do that, you get to the point of what history do you really want to keep? What do you think is good enough? James McPherson said, essentially. His study was your community was your extended family. You couldn't show the white feather. You had to be brave. You had to uphold the values of your community, and you marched off with your local militia company that became a regiment, or was brought into a regiment. So it was your family, your county, your state, your region. And that was why they fought. I think the monuments should stay where they are. If you want to put more of them up, good, because that means you're studying more history.